king is writing a letter he will never send. His name is Amurapi, and he rules the city of Ugarit on the coast of what is now Syria. It is the year 8 of Pharaoh Ramesses III's reign, somewhere close to 1175 BC. And from the roof of his palace he can already see ships on the water. Not trade ships. Not the kind that bring tin from the mountains or wine from Cyprus. These ships are turning toward the harbor, and his own fleet is somewhere else, sent to help an ally who begged for it weeks ago. He writes to the king of Cyprus anyway. Send ships, send soldiers. The enemy is already burning our towns. The letter gets written. It gets sealed. It gets placed in a kiln to harden the clay before a messenger can carry it across the sea. It never leaves the kiln. We will come back to that letter. Hold on to it, because by the end of this story, the silence that follows, it says more than the fire that destroyed the city around it. Right now, rewind. Because to understand why this letter mattered, you need to understand the world Amurapi was writing from, and how impossible it would have seemed only a generation earlier that any of this could fall apart. In the late 1300s BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was not a scattering of isolated kingdoms. It was something closer to a network. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and small trading cities like Ugarit were stitched together by ships carrying copper, tin, grain, glass, ivory, and royal letters, an economy that moved goods across thousands of miles using nothing but sails, oars, and timing. That world looked permanent. It had lasted for centuries. Kings married into rival royal families, armies that fought wars. One decade signed trade treaties, the next. Palaces grew larger, bronze got cheaper. Cities grew fat on trade they assumed would never stop. And then, across roughly 50 years, almost all of it went dark. 5 major powers, burned cities, abandoned capitals, a scatter of letters that simply stop arriving. Historians have a name for the violent group that gets blamed for most of it: the Sea Peoples. But the closer you look at the evidence, the letters, the ash layers, the tree rings, the less it looks like one invasion, and the more it looks like something far stranger, something that didn't have a single cause or a single villain. To understand how big this network really was, picture a single ship. In the 1980s, divers off the coast of southern Turkey found a wreck resting at the bottom of a place called Uluburun. It had gone down sometime in the 1300s BC, a century before Amurapi ever picked up a pen. When archaeologists finally raised its cargo, the inventory read like the contents of half a dozen kingdoms at once. 10 tons of copper and tin ingots shaped like animal hides, stacked in the hull. Glass ingots in blue and turquoise, ebony logs from Africa, ostrich eggshells turned into decorated cups, pottery from Cyprus, jewelry from Canaan, a seal belonging to an Egyptian queen. 1 ship, 7 regions, a single voyage carrying enough raw bronze to arm an army. This is the part most people miss about the Bronze Age. It wasn't bronze swords and stone temples standing in isolation. It was a supply chain, tin hauled from mountains as far away as Afghanistan, Copper from Cyprus, grain from the Nile, all of it flowing along sea routes that took years to learn and decades to build trust along. Historians sometimes call the system underneath these royal courts a palace economy, a setup where one central palace controlled the grain stores, the metal supply, and the trade contracts for an entire kingdom. It worked beautifully when ships kept arriving on schedule. It became a single point of failure the moment they stopped. And for a while, nothing stopped. Egypt was wealthy and stable under pharaohs who built temples meant to outlast time itself. The Hittite Empire, based in the mountain capital of Hattusa, controlled a territory stretching across most of modern Turkey. Rich enough to fight Egypt to a draw at the Battle of Kadesh and then sign a peace treaty with it afterward. One of the oldest surviving peace treaties in human history. Mycenaean Greece ran fortified palace cities, their scribes keeping inventories of bronze, chariots, and grain on clay tablets baked hard enough to survive 3,000 years. Cyprus, known then as Alatia, sat at the center of it all, its copper mines feeding half the bronze in the Mediterranean. It looked unbreakable. It was not. The first crack didn't come from an invasion. It came from a letter, and it came earlier than most people expect. Years before Rameses III ever fought the army that would later be blamed for ending an age. Hittite kings were already writing to Egypt asking for grain, not as a courtesy, as an emergency. Tablets from the Hittite capital describe shipments of wheat being sent south by sea because the harvests at home had failed. Repeatedly, for reasons nobody recorded in enough detail. A king who ruled a quarter of the known world was rationing bread. Stay with that for a second. The empire that once stood toe-to-toe with Egypt at Kadesh was, within a few decades, dependent on Egyptian grain ships just to keep its own capital fed. And the name that would eventually get blamed for breaking this entire system, the Sea Peoples, shows up in the historical record long before the final collapse most people picture. Around 1208 BC, Pharaoh Merneptah recorded a battle against a coalition of Libyan allied raiders. Buried inside that account, almost as a footnote, are names that should sound familiar if you already know how this story ends. The Ekwesh, the Shekelesh, the Shurden. Groups that, decades later, would appear again at Medinet Habu under a different pharaoh, in a battle remembered as far more catastrophic. In other words, the threat didn't arrive all at once, out of nowhere, like a single storm hitting a calm sea. It had been building, in pieces, for at least a generation. Grain shortages here, raiding parties there, each one looking survivable on its own. By the time anyone thought to call it a collapse, most of the damage had already been done quietly, in account, ledgers, and desperate letters, long before a single palace burned. So before we go further into how this fell apart completely, here's where we are. 5 great powers, all running on the same invisible network of ships, grain, and metal. Cracks already showing, years before anyone called it a crisis. And a name, the Sea Peoples, that had already appeared once, quietly, in the margins of a pharaoh's victory record. If you're enjoying tracing this kind of slow-motion collapse, the same one historians are still arguing about. This is exactly the kind of history this channel digs into every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, back to the cracks. Because what happens next isn't one empire falling. It's all of them, falling in roughly the same window, for reasons that don't all match. Start with the empire that vanishes first and most completely. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, sat in the mountains of central Anatolia, protected by walls thick enough to withstand siege engines that didn't exist yet. Under its last known king, Suppiluliuma II, the empire was still fighting. There's even a record of a naval battle near Cyprus. The Hittites apparently building ships to defend trade routes that were already slipping out of their control. That alone tells you something. A land power built on chariots and mountain passes was being forced to fight at sea. The old rules weren't working anymore. And then, within a few short years, Hattusa goes quiet. Archaeologists who later excavated the city found something strange. Not the usual signature of a siege, no thick layer of weapons, no mass graves, no clear invading force. What they found instead were empty rooms. Palace archives stripped of their most valuable tablets, as if someone had time to pack before leaving. Some buildings burned, but in patterns that suggest the fires came after people, not during an attack. The empire didn't just lose a battle. It appears to have unraveled administratively before anyone lit a single match. Here is where the climate record finally enters and where the story gets stranger. Sediment cores pulled from lake beds and pollen counts taken across Cyprus and the Levant point to something nobody fighting these wars could have understood at the time. A drought, not one bad harvest, but a long one, stretching across multiple decades in the late 1200s BC. Tree rings growing thinner year after year. Riverbeds that should have run year-round, drying to cracked mud by midsummer. Wells recorded in some local texts as failing outright. None of it explains everything on its own. Historians still argue over exactly how severe this drought was, and whether it struck every region equally. But layer it on top of grain shortages already documented in Hittite letters, on top of trade routes already straining to deliver tin and copper on schedule, and a pattern starts to form that no single battle can account for. This is the part that breaks the simple version of the story. It wasn't one army marching from city to city. It was famine in one kingdom, a fleet stretched too thin in another, a generation of weakened harvests in a third, failures that didn't cause each other directly, but that hit the same network in the same decades until the network itself stopped holding. Look south across the sea to the Mycenaean palace of Pylos, and you can see a kingdom that knew something was coming, even if it didn't know what. Clay tablets recovered from Pylos's final destruction layer, baked hard by the very fire that ended the palace. The same way Ugarit's letters would later be preserved, record last-minute military orders. Watchers posted along the coast, bronze workers reassigned, some marked as missing from their usual posts, as if the kingdom were stripping its workshops to arm men instead. These aren't the records of a kingdom caught by surprise. They're the records of a kingdom that saw ships, or rumors of ships, and started making decisions in a hurry. It didn't save it. Pylos burns not long after these tablets are written, and it is never rebuilt as a palace center again. 3 kingdoms, Hatti, Pylos, and the Famine, quietly working through both of them. 3 different symptoms of the same illness, none of them caused by an army that anyone can point to with certainty. And the network that once moved tin from Afghanistan to swords in Greece is now a network with too many broken links to keep functioning at all. Which brings us back to that letter. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, was one of the richest trading cities in the Bronze Age world. Not an empire, not a military power, but a hub. Ships from Cyprus, Egypt, and the Aegean all passed through its harbor. Its archives, written in half a dozen languages, show a city plugged directly into every major power in the region. By the time Hammurabi sits down to write his letter to Al-Ashiyah, that wealth has become a liability. The same ships that once arrived loaded with copper and wine are now treated as an opportunity by people with nothing left to lose. Who exactly those people were is still debated. Some historians picture displaced Aegean and Anatolian populations, entire communities pushed off their land by the same famine and trade breakdown we just traced through Hatti and Pylos. Others picture a looser, shifting mix of raiders, mercenaries, and opportunists from several regions, drawn together less by a shared identity than by shared desperation. What both versions agree on is this: Ugarit's own military and fleet are away, sent to help defend a neighboring territory, and the city that helped hold the whole trading network together is, for the first time in generations, undefended. This is not a story about one army. This is not a story about one bad decision by one king. This is a story about an entire system that ran out of slack at the exact moment every kingdom needed it most. Hammurabi's letter, the one sealed, hardened in the kiln, and never delivered, asks for ships and grain from an ally who, it turns out, is dealing with raiders of his own. Cyprus can't help. No one can. The letter sits in that kiln for 3,000 years, found by archaeologists in the 1950s, still hard, still unsent, still asking a question nobody ever answered. Ugarit burns. It is never resettled as a city again, not rebuilt, not reoccupied, just gone, the silence after the fire louder, in its way, than anything written about the fire itself. And while Ugarit falls quietly, Egypt is fighting the same enemy loudly on 2 fronts and, for now, winning. Around 1175 BC, in his 8th year as pharaoh, Ramesses III faces what the temple walls at Medinet Habu describe as a coalition unlike anything Egypt had fought before. Named groups including the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, arriving by land with ox carts carrying entire families, and by sea in ships with distinctive bird head prows. This isn't a raiding party. It looks like a migration with weapons attached, entire populations on the move, pushed forward by the same collapse swallowing the kingdoms behind them. Egyptian forces meet them twice. Once on land near the Egyptian frontier, once at sea in the Nile Delta, where Rameses's archers line the riverbanks, and his ships trap the enemy fleet against the shore. The temple reliefs show capsized boats, drowning warriors, a battle Egypt wins decisively enough to record it in stone for the ages. Egypt survives, but it survives smaller, poorer, and shaken. Never again the empire it had been one generation earlier. The pharaohs who follow Ramesses III rule a kingdom in slow decline, still standing, but standing on a network that had already lost half its partners. Here's the modern bridge. Because this isn't only an ancient problem. Think of the Bronze Age trade web the same way you'd think of a global supply chain today. Tin from one end of the known world, copper from another, grain crossing a sea to keep an empire fed. The same palace economy logic running underneath all of it. Remove one link, and a resilient system absorbs it. Remove 3 or 4 at once, a drought lasting decades. A fleet stretched thin, a famine emptying granaries, raiders cutting the routes that used to carry replacements, and the same system that looked unbreakable for centuries can come apart in a single human lifetime. Modern infrastructure researchers studying cascading failures see the same shape, not one point of collapse, but several weak points failing together until the whole network goes dark at once. That's the part that should unsettle you more than any battle scene. The Sea Peoples didn't tear down a healthy world. They were one more pressure on a world that had already been failing. Quietly, for longer than anyone fighting at the time understood. And somewhere in a buried palace archive, a king's last letter is still sitting in the kiln. No reply ever came. None ever could. So what actually ended the Bronze Age? Not one invasion. Not one villain. The Sea Peoples were real. Egypt fought them, recorded them, and named them in stone. But the closer historians look, the more those raiders look like a symptom of the collapse rather than its cause. People set in motion by decades of drought, broken trade, and failing harvests, washing up against kingdoms that were already running out of slack. 3 things worth carrying with you. First, the truth. This wasn't a single empire falling to a single enemy. It was a network. Egypt, Hatti, Mycenaean, Ugarit, Cyprus, all wired together by ships and grain and copper. And that same connection meant that when enough parts failed at once, none of them could fail alone. Second, the part that matters today. You live inside a version of this same network. Food that crossed oceans to reach you. Materials mined on one continent, assembled on another. Most of the time, it holds. The Bronze Age is a 3,000-year-old reminder of what happens when it doesn't. Third, and this is the one that should stay with you. Somewhere in a burned palace archive, there is a letter that never reached the person it was written for. The clay still bearing the fingerprints of the scribe who pressed it closed. A king believed, right up until the end, that help was still possible. It wasn't. And the silence that followed his last message outlasted every army that marched that century. Which fallen kingdom in this story hit you the hardest? Ugarit, waiting for ships that never came. Hattusa, emptied out before it ever burned. Or Egypt, the one power that survived, but never the same? Tell me below. The Bronze Age didn't end with a bang loud enough for anyone to record it as one single event. It ended in letters that stopped being answered.